The year was 793. A storm brewed off the coast of Northumbria as shadowy longships sliced through the waves, their dragon-headed prows glinting in the pale dawn light. The monks of Lindisfarne had no warning before the raiders struck. Their monastery, a sanctuary of learning and faith, was plundered in a single brutal morning. Gold vanished, manuscripts burned, and the terrified survivors whispered of men from the north who seemed more demons than humans. This raid didn't just terrify England, it sent shockwaves across all of medieval Europe, marking the explosive beginning of the Viking Age. But what if I told you that an almost identical attack, just a few years later on the shores of Ireland, would ripple through history with even greater force? One raid, one moment of chaos, would unravel the political and cultural fabric of an entire nation, setting Ireland on a path no one could have foreseen. Picture this, a land of ancient kingdoms where high kings ruled from sacred hills and monks preserved knowledge in towering round towers. Ireland, isolated by sea, had weathered centuries of internal strife, but nothing could prepare it for the arrival of the Vikings. When their longships finally appeared on the horizon, it wasn't just treasure they took. They shattered old alliances, ignited new power struggles, and forced Ireland to rewrite its destiny. This isn't just a story of violence and conquest. It's about how a single event can bend the arc of history, leaving fingerprints on everything from trade routes to the very language spoken in the streets. So how did one raid change everything? The answer lies in the chaos that followed, the way kingdoms fractured, the way towns rose where none had stood before, and the way Ireland was thrust onto the world stage, no longer an island apart. By the time the dust settled, nothing looked the same. The old order was gone, replaced by something entirely new, and it all began with those first fateful longships appearing in the mist. This is the story of how a single Viking raid didn't just rewrite Ireland's history, it reinvented it. Stick around, because what comes next is a tale of survival, adaptation, and the unexpected twists that shape nations. To understand why the Vikings set their sights on Ireland, we need to step back and see the world through their eyes. These weren't just mindless raiders, they were master navigators, traders, and opportunists from a land where harsh winters and rocky soil made survival a constant struggle. Scandinavia's fjords and forests bred a people uniquely suited to the sea, with shipbuilding skills far ahead of their time. Their iconic longships, sleek and shallow, could glide up rivers or cross open ocean, giving them unmatched mobility. But what drove them to venture so far from home? It wasn't just about plunder. Back in Norway and Denmark, powerful chieftains fought for control, leaving younger sons to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Meanwhile, the growing trade networks of Europe dangled tempting prizes: silver from the Islamic world, Frankish wine, and Irish gold. The Vikings were drawn to Ireland for the same reasons they targeted England and France: wealth, land, and opportunity. But Ireland was different. Unlike the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Ireland's patchwork of petty kingdoms and high kings made it ripe for exploitation. There was no centralized army to resist them, just rival clans locked in age-old feuds. And the monasteries, they were virtual treasure houses packed with liturgical objects, books bound in precious metals, and no garrisons to defend them. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon Ireland by accident. They came because word had spread this was a land where a clever raider could carve out a kingdom of his own. By the time the first longships appeared off Ireland's coast around the year 795, the Norse had already perfected their tactics. They'd strike fast, vanish before local forces could rally, then returned to demand tribute. But something unexpected happened in Ireland. Instead of just raiding and retreating, they began to stay. Natural harbors like Dublin, nestled at the mouth of the River Liffey, became fortified trading posts. These weren't just temporary camps, they grew into bustling towns, hubs for a new economy where slaves, amber, and Irish wool changed hands. The Vikings didn't just take from Ireland, they became part of it, weaving themselves into the island's story in ways no one could have predicted. Yet amid this slow colonization, one raid in particular would send shockwaves through the island. It happened in the year 834, when a warlord named Thorgest, or Turges, as the Irish chroniclers called him, launched an attack so audacious it would alter the course of Irish history. He didn't just sack a monastery, he targeted the very heart of Ireland's spiritual and political life, a place so symbolic that its fall would expose the vulnerability of every kingdom on the island. This wasn't just another Viking raid. It was the moment Ireland's old order began to crumble. Long before the first Viking sails darkened Ireland's shores, the island was a tapestry of small, fiercely independent kingdoms, each ruled by its own clan with ambitions as vast as the rolling green hills. There was no single, unified nation, only a fragile patchwork of petty kings who paid lip service to the High King at Tara, a ceremonial title more symbolic than sovereign. Power shifted like the tides, with alliances forged and broken over cattle raids, disputed borders, and generations-old blood feuds. This was a world where a chieftain's worth was measured in cows and hostages, where poets could make or break a ruler's reputation with a satirical verse, and where the law itself was memorized by judges who passed it down orally for centuries. At the heart of this fragmented society stood the monasteries, not just quiet retreats for prayer, but bustling powerhouses of wealth and influence. In a land without cities, these fortified settlements were Ireland's closest equivalent to urban centers. Monks transcribed ancient texts in candlelit scriptoria, preserving not only Christian teachings but the works of Greece and Rome, long forgotten elsewhere in Europe. Their workshops produced intricate metalwork chalices inlaid with amber, crosses gleaming with gold, while their storehouses bulged with grain, honey, and the tribute of local lords. To the Irish, these were sacred spaces. To Viking eyes, they were unguarded vaults of treasure, and that was the problem. Ireland's very strength, its decentralized power, its rich but isolated monasteries left it dangerously exposed. Unlike the Roman walls of England or the Frankish armies of Charlemagne, Ireland had no standing forces, no coastal watchtowers, no unified strategy to repel invaders. When rival clans weren't skirmishing over pastureland, they were hiring Norse mercenaries to fight their battles, unknowingly inviting the wolf into the fold. Even the weather played its part. Prevailing winds made Ireland's eastern coast a natural landing point for ships sailing from Norway, while its maze of rivers offered highways deep into the interior. The stage was set for disaster. In the decades before the Vikings arrived, Irish annals recorded ominous signs, strange lights in the sky, plagues, droughts, as if the land itself sensed the coming storm. Then, in the year 795, just 2 years after Lindisfarne's devastation, the first longships appeared off the coast of Antrim. The initial raids were swift and surgical, targeting island monasteries like Rathlin and Inishmore. The monks who had once feared only the occasional cattle thief now faced warriors who saw holy books as kindling and sacred relics as scrap metal. But these early attacks were mere probes compared to what came next. By the 820s, the raids escalated into full-scale invasions, with Viking fleets numbering dozens of ships. The Irish, divided by ancient rivalries, would soon learn the price of their disunity, and the Vikings, sensing opportunity, would rewrite the rules of the game entirely. What happened next wasn't just a clash of cultures, but a collision that would force Ireland to reinvent itself. The Vikings didn't just exploit Ireland's weaknesses, they exposed them, tearing away the illusion of stability and leaving the island's kingdoms with a brutal choice: adapt or perish. And in that chaos, an unlikely transformation began, one that would turn raiders into rulers, monasteries into fortresses, and a fractured land into something entirely new. The Monastery of Armagh stood as a crown jewel of Irish Christianity, a sacred center where generations of scholars had preserved knowledge and kings came to seek blessings. But in the spring of 832, its quiet courtyards echoed with screams instead of prayers. Norse warriors poured through its gates, axes gleaming, their shouts cutting through the chants of monks. This wasn't just another raid, it was a calculated strike at the very soul of Ireland. Armagh held relics of St. Patrick himself, manuscripts painstakingly copied over centuries, and treasures donated by kings. The Vikings took it all. Gold crosses were ripped from altars, precious books fed to flames, and scores of monks dragged away in chains, not just as slaves, but as bargaining chips for future ransom. What made Armagh different was the sheer audacity behind it. Earlier raids had targeted isolated coastal monasteries, but Armagh lay inland, deep in the heart of Ulster. Reaching it meant the Vikings were no longer testing the waters, they were carving paths into Ireland's interior with terrifying confidence, and they didn't just vanish afterward. Witnesses reported Norse warriors defiling the high altar, their chieftain even declaring himself a king of the sacred site. This was psychological warfare. For the Irish, monasteries weren't just buildings, they were spiritual fortresses, places where heaven touched earth. Seeing Armagh's sanctity violated sent shockwaves through every kingdom. If the holiest place in Ireland wasn't safe, nowhere was. The raid's aftermath revealed an even darker truth. Unlike hit and run attacks of the past, the Norse began fortifying nearby bases, turning riverbanks into permanent strongholds. Suddenly, the Irish weren't just facing raiders, they were facing settlers. Armagh's fall marked the moment Vikings shifted from seasonal plunder to year-round occupation, transforming from external threats into players in Ireland's own power struggles. Local kings, desperate for allies against old rivals, even hired Norse mercenaries, unknowingly feeding the beast that would eventually consume them. Yet within this chaos lay the seeds of Ireland's transformation. The Vikings didn't just bring destruction, they forced adaptation. Monasteries began building round towers not for beauty, but as lookout posts and bolt holes. Kings who once fought over cattle now scrambled to forge unprecedented alliances, and those Norse settlements, they'd soon become trading hubs, weaving Ireland into a vast network stretching from Constantinople to Greenland. Armagh's ashes, in the end, didn't just symbolize loss, they ignited a fire that would reshape the island forever. The destruction of Armagh marked a turning point not just in how the Vikings operated, but in how Ireland itself would function for centuries to come. No longer content with hit-and-run attacks, the Norse began digging in, quite literally. Along the winding rivers of Ireland, they built long forts, fortified enclaves with earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, designed to repel Irish counterattacks while serving as bases for deeper incursions. These weren't just temporary camps, they were the blueprints for Ireland's first true urban centers. Places like Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford began as Viking strongholds, their strategic locations controlling access to inland trade routes and fertile plains. What drove this shift from raiding to settling? The answer lies in cold, hard economics. Early raids had yielded sacred relics and altar gold, but these were finite treasures. The real wealth of Ireland lay in its people captives sold in far-off slave markets and its natural resources. Norse traders discovered that Irish wool, hides, and hunting dogs fetched premium prices in European markets, while the island's rivers teemed with salmon perfect for salting and export. A single trading voyage could now outturn a season of raids with none of the bloodshed. The Vikings, ever pragmatic, adapted. Their longships, once filled with warriors, now carried scales and weights, their hulls packed with goods rather than weapons. But the most surprising transformation was cultural. As Norse settlers put down roots, they began marrying into local Irish families, forging alliances that blurred the lines between invader and native. Gaelic names started appearing in Viking households, while Norse words seeped into the Irish language, terms like margad for market and pingin for penny. Even religion became fluid. Some Viking leaders embraced Christianity, not out of piety but politics, knowing that a baptized king could negotiate with Irish rulers on equal footing. This cultural entanglement didn't mean peace. The 9th and 10th centuries saw brutal power struggles, with Viking warlords and Irish kings jockeying for control. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable emerged. A hybrid society where round towers stood beside Norse shipyards, where Gaelic poets composed verses about Viking heroes, and where the clink of silver in Dublin streets echoed as far as Baghdad. The Vikings hadn't just conquered parts of Ireland, they'd become part of its DNA. Their greatest legacy, the very concept of a town. Before the Norse arrived, Ireland's power centers were royal forts or monastic cities. The Vikings introduced something radical, urban life built around commerce, not kings or clergy. Streets lined with craftsmen's workshops, docks bustling with foreign merchants, houses clustered not by clan but by trade. This was a revolution in how people lived. And when the Irish eventually reclaimed these settlements, they kept the blueprint. Dublin's winding streets still follow the paths trodden by Norse traders over 1,000 years ago. The Vikings came as destroyers, but in the end, they became builders laying the foundations of an Ireland that would outlast them all. Dublin's story begins not with kings or saints, but with the pragmatic genius of Viking traders. Around the year 841, Norse ships pushed past the sandbanks at the mouth of the river Liffey, finding a sheltered bend where freshwater met the tide. This wasn't just another landing spot, it was a gold mine. The Liffey's deep channel allowed ships to anchor safely, while its winding course gave access to the rich farmlands of Ireland's interior. Here, the Vikings built more than a long fort. They planted the seed of what would become the island's beating heart. Archaeology paints a vivid picture of early Dublin. Beneath today's bustling streets lie layers of Norse-era timbers, homes with walls of wattle and daub, workshops where amber and silver gleamed under craftsmen's tools. At Wood Quay, excavations revealed a stunning find. The remains of a Viking ship deliberately buried, its hull repurposed as part of the settlement's waterfront defenses. This wasn't just recycling, it was a statement. The Norse weren't passing through, they were putting down roots quite literally, using their most prized possessions to fortify their new home. Trade transformed Dublin from a warlord's base into a cosmopolitan hub. Irish annals mention merchants from as far as Spain and North Africa bartering in its muddy streets. Norse scales, unearthed by archaeologists, still bear tiny traces of silver dust, evidence of countless transactions. The city became a melting pot where Gaelic cattle lords rubbed shoulders with Frisian cloth dealers, where slave chains jangled beside bolts of Byzantine silk. Dublin's real power lay in this diversity. It wasn't just a Viking town, it was Ireland's first true international port, but prosperity bred conflict. Irish kings watched with growing unease as Dublin's wealth tipped the balance of power. The Norse ruler Olaf the White didn't just call himself a king, he married into the Gaelic Uí Níl dynasty, blending Norse ambition with Irish royal bloodlines. When rival clans clashed, it was often Dublin's warriors who decided the outcome, their loyalty bought with promises of land or loot. The city became a chess piece in Ireland's endless power games, its allegiance more valuable than any fortress. Yet Dublin's greatest legacy wasn't political, it was cultural. The Norse introduced urban living to a rural island. Streets like Fishamble Street, still following its Viking Age curve, show how daily life revolved around trade, not tribal loyalties. Words like anchor and knife entered Irish from Old Norse, while Dublin's Hiberno-Norse coinage became the island's first standardized currency. Even after Irish kings reclaimed the city in the 10th century, they kept its Viking-built infrastructure, recognizing its value. The raiders had unwittingly given Ireland its future capital, a place where the clash of cultures forged something entirely new. For decades, the Vikings had manipulated Ireland's divisions, playing kingdom against kingdom, but the rise of one man would change the game entirely. Brian Boru wasn't born to a throne. He emerged from the Dalcashian clan, a minor power in Munster, where his family had spent generations fending off Norse raids along the Shannon River. What set Brian apart wasn't just his military genius, but his vision. While other kings sought temporary victories, he dreamed of something radical, a united Ireland, free of both Viking warlords and the infighting that had left the island vulnerable. His rise began with patient, relentless strategy. First, he secured his home territory, then methodically forged alliances through marriage and diplomacy, offering protection to monasteries tired of being Viking prey. By the year 1002, he'd broken the Ui Neil dynasty's centuries-old grip on the High Kingship, declaring himself Ard Rai not by birthright but by sheer will. Brian's crown came with a target. Dublin's Norse rulers, led by King Sitric Silkbeard, chafed under his authority, while rebellious Irish clans saw an opportunity to weaken Munster's rising power. The tension erupted at Clontarf on Good Friday, 1014. The battle was no simple clash of Irish versus Vikings. It was a tangled web of rivalries. On one side stood Brian's forces, a mix of Munster men and allied kingdoms. On the other, a coalition of Dublin Norse, their Viking cousins from the Isle of Man, and Leinster Irishmen who'd rather side with old enemies than accept Brian's rule. The fighting was brutal, a day-long melee of axes and spears in the tidal flats north of Dublin. Though Brian's army prevailed, the cost was staggering. The 70-year-old High King himself was slain in his tent by fleeing Norse warriors, a martyr's death that would cement his legend. But here's where history gets twisted. Clontarf wasn't the clean victory later storytellers claimed. Vikings didn't vanish from Ireland after one battle. Dublin remained a Norse Gaelic city for generations, its trade networks intact. What changed was the story Ireland told itself. Brian's death became a rallying cry, proof that unity was possible even if fleeting. His successors would invoke his name for centuries, turning Clontarf into a symbol of resistance against all foreign domination, long after the Vikings had traded swords for scales. The Norse, meanwhile, kept adapting. They'd already become part of Ireland's fabric, their bloodlines mingling with Gaelic families, their towns too valuable to destroy. The real lesson of Clontarf wasn't about driving out invaders. It was about how Ireland, forged in that crucible of conflict, began to imagine itself as something greater than a collection of warring tribes. The Vikings left scars, but they also left gifts, urban centers, trade routes, even words that still roll off Irish tongues. By the time the Normans arrived in the 12th century, Dublin's Norse descendants would fight alongside Gaelic kings, their shared history outweighing old hatreds. Brian Boru's dream of unity remained unfinished, but the Ireland that emerged was neither purely Gaelic nor Norse. It was something new, shaped by the fire of Clontarf, but also by the quieter revolutions of intermarriage, commerce, and time. The Vikings didn't just raid Ireland, they helped redefine it, leaving behind a legacy far more complex than any battle could capture. The collision of Norse and Gaelic cultures didn't just leave scars, it sparked a creative explosion that reshaped Ireland's identity. Take language for instance. Everyday Irish still carries echoes of those Viking encounters. Words like fuinniog for window, borrowed from the Old Norse vindoga, or margad for market, rooted in their bustling trade hubs. Even something as simple as the word egg traces back to Norse settlers, replacing the older Gaelic term. This wasn't just vocabulary swapping, it was evidence of two worlds knitting together, one conversation at a time. Art tells an even richer story. Viking metalworkers brought intricate animal motifs, serpents entwined in looping patterns, wolves with elongated limbs, that soon wove their way into Irish craftsmanship. The Cross of Cong, a masterpiece of 12th century metalwork, might celebrate an Irish saint, but its swirling designs owe as much to Norse aesthetics as Celtic tradition. Meanwhile, in places like Dublin's Fishamble Street, archaeologists uncovered brooches that blend Norse geometric precision with Gaelic curvilinear flair. These weren't imitations, they were innovations born from artisans sharing tools and techniques across cultural lines. Legal systems also blurred. The Norse introduced concepts like thing assemblies, public gatherings to settle disputes, which influenced Irish Brehon law's emphasis on communal justice. Some coastal towns even operated under hybrid codes, fines calculated in silver ounces, a Viking preference but paid to Gaelic chieftains. This legal cross-pollination reveals something profound. The Vikings weren't just overlords or invaders. They became neighbors, their customs gradually folding into Ireland's social fabric. Nowhere was this fusion more visible than in the emergence of the Hiberno-Norse, a people neither fully Gaelic nor entirely Viking. Their graves tell the tale, swords laid beside crucifixes, Norse runes carved next to Gaelic prayers. In Limerick, excavations revealed a woman buried with a traditional Norse oval brooch, but her bones showed a childhood diet of Irish grains, not Scandinavian fish. These were children of two worlds, straddling cultures in life and death. And then there were the towns. Before the Vikings, Ireland's settlements revolved around royal forts or monasteries. The Norse introduced something revolutionary, urban centers built for commerce, not just kings or clergy. Dublin's winding streets, its docks bristling with foreign ships, its workshops producing goods for export. This was a new way of living. Over time, the Irish didn't just tolerate these towns, they embraced them. Gaelic elites moved in, marrying into Norse families, their children speaking a mix of both languages. The very idea of what it meant to be Irish expanded, no longer bound by tribal borders but shaped by the rhythms of market squares and shipyards. This cultural alchemy set the stage for an economic transformation. The same trade networks that brought Norse longships to Ireland now carried its goods across Europe. Irish wool warming backs in London, slaves from Dublin's markets toiling in Moorish Spain. Silver from as far as Baghdad turned up in Viking Age hoards buried near Irish monasteries, proof of a connectedness the island had never known. The Vikings didn't just raid Ireland's wealth, they plugged it into the medieval world's bustling marketplace, forever altering its destiny. What began with fire and axe would end with coins changing hands and cultures entwined, an unexpected legacy forged not just in conflict, but in the quiet, daily acts of shared survival. Before the Vikings arrived, Ireland's economy ran on cattle and barter, a world where a man's wealth was counted in livestock, not coin. A fine cloak might be traded for 3 pigs, a sword for 10 sacks of grain. But when Norse traders began weighing silver on Dublin's muddy docks, they introduced something revolutionary: a cash economy. Those small, brass scales archaeologists have unearthed by the dozens weren't just tools, they were symbols of a seismic shift. Suddenly, value could be measured in ounces of gleaming metal, portable across kingdoms and continents. The Vikings didn't just bring scales, they plugged Ireland into a vast commercial network stretching from the icy fjords of Norway to the bustling markets of Baghdad. Irish wool, prized for its quality, wrapped shoulders as far away as Novgorod. Hunting dogs bred in Munster-guarded estates in Frankish lands, and then there were the slaves, a grim but lucrative trade. Irish captives seized in raids or wars fetched high prices in Moorish Spain and beyond. Dublin became a hub in this dark commerce, its docks witnessing lines of shackled men and women boarded onto ships bound for distant ports. But the most enduring innovation was coinage. Around the year 997, Dublin's Norse king, Sitric Silkbeard, did something unprecedented. He minted Ireland's first coins. These weren't crude imitations, they bore his name and title in Latin, a savvy blend of Viking authority and Christian legitimacy. The coins mirrored designs from England and Scandinavia, a deliberate choice to make them recognizable in foreign markets. Suddenly, Irish merchants could trade without haggling over the worth of a cow or the weight of silver hack money. Commerce became faster, smoother, more precise. Excavations at Wood Quay reveal the vibrant world these coins circulated in. Layers of fish bones and oyster shells hint at bustling waterfront markets. Finds like amber from the Baltic, silk threads likely from Byzantium, and even a fragment of Indian glass proved Dublin's reach. The Vikings didn't just take, they transformed Ireland into a player in Europe's emerging medieval economy. Yet with these connections came new dangers. The same ships carrying silk and silver also brought swords and rivalries. Dublin's wealth made it a target not just for Irish kings, but for Viking warlords eyeing its profits. Trade routes became invasion highways, and the coins that symbolized prosperity would soon fund armies. Ireland's economic awakening came with a price, the realization that isolation was no longer an option, and that every silver penny carried both promise and peril. Beneath the glitter of traded silver and amber lay a far darker commerce, one that bound Ireland to the medieval world in chains. The Vikings didn't just raid for gold, they trafficked in human lives, turning Ireland's shores into a grim marketplace for slaves. Captives taken from monasteries, villages, and rival clans were marched in shackles to coastal hubs like Dublin, where they'd be sold to the highest bidder. Some ended up laboring on Norse farms in Iceland, others rode galleys in the Mediterranean, and the unluckiest were shipped to the sprawling slave markets of Constantinople, their fate sealed by the clink of silver on a trader's scale. What made this trade especially chilling was its scale. Irish annals describe entire communities emptied, men, women, even children hauled onto longships like cargo. Archaeologists digging near Dublin's old docks uncovered rusted iron shackles, their narrow rings sized for wrists and ankles, silent witnesses to this brutal industry. But here's the uncomfortable truth: Irish kings weren't just victims. Some saw opportunity in the chaos, selling rivals into bondage or hiring Viking mercenaries to seize captives for them. The line between predator and participant blurred, as Gaelic chieftains used the slave trade to weaken enemies and enrich themselves. This wasn't just about profit, it reshaped Ireland's social fabric. Slavery had existed before the Vikings, but they industrialized it, creating networks that reached across Europe. The threat of capture hung over every coastal village, forcing communities to build fortified crannogs, artificial islands in lakes, or seek protection from local warlords, further entrenching feudal hierarchies. Even the clergy wasn't safe. Monasteries began training warrior monks, their once peaceful enclaves now ringed with walls, a stark admission that piety alone couldn't shield them from the marketplace's cruelty. Yet the Vikings' most lasting damage wasn't the chains they forged, but the divisions they exploited. By playing kingdoms against each other, they turned Ireland's age-old rivalries into a zero-sum game where defeat meant enslavement. A king might hire Norse warriors to attack a neighbor, only to find those same mercenaries turning on him once his coffers ran dry. The slave trade didn't just export people, it eroded trust, making alliances brittle and reconciliation impossible. And then came the ripple effects. Dublin's slave markets attracted buyers from as far as Islamic Spain, drawing the attention of powers beyond Ireland. The island, once a backwater, became a node in a vast web of medieval globalization connected, but at a terrible cost. The Vikings didn't just change Ireland's economy or politics. They forced its people to confront hard choices about complicity, survival, and what they were willing to sacrifice to endure in a world where every shoreline might hide a dragon-proud ship. The Viking raids didn't just steal Ireland's treasures, they shattered its fragile political order. For centuries, the island's patchwork of petty kingdoms had maintained an uneasy balance, with the High King at Tara serving more as a symbolic figurehead than a true ruler. But when Norse longships began carving up the coastline, that delicate system collapsed like a sandcastle at high tide. The Nail dynasty, long the dominant force in the north, saw their authority crumble as monasteries under their protection went up in flames. Monastic annals from the 9th century tell a damning story. Kings who promised sanctuary then failed to muster defenses when Viking axes splintered their gates. A high king's worth was measured by his ability to shield sacred sites, and each burned scriptorium eroded his people's faith in the old order. What emerged was a free-for-all of shifting alliances. Local rulers, desperate to survive, began playing Vikings against each other, hiring one warlord's band to fend off another's raids, only to find themselves indebted to both. The Norse, quick to spot opportunity, shifted from invaders to power brokers. Dublin's rulers like Olaf the White and later Sihtric Silkbeard didn't just build a city, they crafted a kingdom, marrying into Gaelic noble families while keeping their Norse warrior elite. Sihtric's reign epitomized this duality. He minted coins with Christian crosses but kept a personal guard of axe-wielding heathens from the Orkneys. Dublin became a wild card in Irish politics, its loyalty swaying wars between Munster and Ulster, its wealth bankrolling factions across the island. This fragmentation had dire consequences. Without a centralized force to resist them, Viking warbands penetrated deeper inland, turning rivers like the Shannon and the Boyne into highways for pillage. Irish kings, instead of uniting against the threat, doubled down on old rivalries. Leinster clans siding with Norse mercenaries to settle scores with Meath, Connacht lords paying silver to Viking captains for an edge over their neighbors. The once sacred title of High King became a hollow prize, fought over by warlords who controlled barely more than their own cattle herds, and then came the final twist. By the time Brian Boru briefly united Ireland in the early 11th century, the damage was done. The island's political landscape had become a chessboard where Norse-held ports like Waterford and Limerick functioned as independent city-states, their rulers more adept at playing Gaelic factions against each other than any Irish king had ever been at resisting them. This wasn't just disunity, it was institutionalized chaos, a system so fractured that when the Normans arrived in the 12th century, they exploited these divisions with surgical precision. The Vikings hadn't just weakened Ireland, they'd rewritten its rules of power, leaving behind a legacy of division that would echo for centuries. Yet amid this turmoil, another transformation was unfolding, one not of swords and crowns but of faith and ink. As kings faltered, Ireland's monasteries began adapting in ways no one could have predicted. The Viking raids didn't just threaten Ireland's gold, they struck at the very foundation of its spiritual life. For centuries, the island's Christianity had revolved around great monastic settlements like Clontarf and Iona, where wandering scholars copied scripture in candlelit scriptoria and abbots wielded influence rivaling kings. These were more than religious centers, they were the keepers of Irish identity, repositories of law, history, and art. But when Norse axes splintered their gates, the church faced an existential choice: adapt or disappear. The transformation began with physical defenses. Round towers, now iconic symbols of medieval Ireland, weren't built for beauty, they were fortresses in disguise. Monks would scramble up removable ladders to these slender stone sentinels, hauling precious manuscripts with them as Viking raiders torched the buildings below. The Book of Kells itself likely survived because of such desperate measures, carried from monastery to monastery like a holy fugitive, but walls couldn't solve the deeper problem. The old Columban system, with its emphasis on isolated monastic communities loyal only to their founding saints, left the church dangerously fragmented. A monastery might be sacked while its neighbor, just a day's walk away, remained untouched not by strategy, but because rival monastic families refused to coordinate defenses. Enter the bishops. As the 9th century wore on, a new model emerged: diocesan structures mirroring those on the continent, with clearly defined territories under centralized leadership. This wasn't just organizational change, it was a theological revolution. The Irish Church, once proud of its independence from Rome, now sought closer ties with the papacy, recognizing that survival required allies beyond the sea. By the 12th century, synods like Cashel in 1172 formally aligned Irish practices with European norms, from marriage laws to the dating of Easter. Yet the most profound shift came in who held power. The great monastic dynasties, the Columban's, the patricians, saw their influence wane as new orders arrived. Cistercian monks, with their white robes and strict Benedictine rule, established abbeys at Mellifont and Boyle, their very architecture signaling a break from the past. Unlike the round towers of old, these were expansive complexes designed for communal living, their cruciform churches proclaiming unity with Christendom. The Vikings hadn't just changed how the Irish defended their faith, they'd altered what that faith looked like. Amid this upheaval, something remarkable survived: Ireland's artistic soul. The Book of Durrow, the Ardagh Chalice, and other masterpieces weren't just hidden from raiders, they became symbols of resilience. Monks fleeing burned scriptoria carried not only gospels but techniques, blending Norse animal interlace with traditional Celtic spirals in works like the Cross of Cong. Even the language bore witness to this fusion. Old Norse words like anker for anchor and bod for boat seeped into Irish, while Gaelic terms for law and landholding found their way into Viking settlements. The church that emerged from the raids was neither purely Irish nor wholly European, but something new, forged in the fires of invasion, yet still bearing the unmistakable glow of its origins. This linguistic legacy runs deeper than vocabulary. The very way Irish monks recorded their history changed under Viking pressure. Annals once filled with saintly miracles began noting Norse movements with cold precision. The foreigners came this year and burned Clontarf, as if the quill itself had learned to sharpen against invaders. Yet in a final twist, some of these same chronicles would later document Viking kings donating to rebuilt monasteries. their names written in the same ink as the saints they'd once terrorized. The line between destroyer and patron had blurred, just as the old Ireland had blurred into the new. Walk down any street in modern Dublin, and you're treading paths named by Vikings 1,000 years ago. That's the strange magic of language, how a handful of Norse syllables, tossed ashore by raiders, could take root and outlast empires. Take Wexford, its name a garbled echo of Vesafjörður, the muddy fjord those first longship crews saw as they rode inland. Or Lakeslip from Lax H. Lop, Salmon Leap, where silver fish still dart upstream, oblivious to the Viking fishermen who once netted them. Even Dublin itself, Dublin, Black Pool, carries the imprint of Norse tongues reshaping Gaelic geography. But it's not just place names. Listen closely to modern Irish, and you'll catch whispers of Viking vocab woven into everyday speech. The word margad for market. Straight from the Old Norse markather, a relic of those bustling docks where Norse traders haggled over wool and walrus ivory. Bard for boat, and care for anchor. These weren't just borrowed words, they were necessities, adopted because the Norse introduced concepts Ireland hadn't needed names for before. Even something as simple as pingin, the Irish for penny, traces back to Norse commerce, a tiny linguistic coin minted in the fires of cultural exchange. Deeper still are the personal names that slipped into Irish genealogy, hiding in plain sight. Surnames like MacAuliffe, MacAmbib, son of Olaf or Doyle, Oacute Dubgale, descendant of the Dark Foreigner, aren't just family history. They're living proof of Norse settlers who didn't just raid and leave, but stayed, married, and became part of the tapestry. These names survived wars, famines, centuries of change, because integration wasn't just political. It was intimate, written into the cradle songs of children who grew up with Norse blood and Gaelic hearts. What's astonishing is how these linguistic clues align with the dirt and bone evidence archaeologists have unearthed. At Wood Quay, beneath Dublin's modern streets, Norse-era fish bones and amber beads tell the same story as the words we still speak of a port where Gaelic and Norse voices mingled. A comb carved from reindeer antler found near Christchurch Cathedral bears runes spelling its owner's name, Thorgrim, not a raider but a craftsman, someone who set down roots. Even the humble herringbones in Viking Age trash pits whisper of daily life, of meals shared between cultures that once saw each other as enemies. Language and archaeology together reveal a truth darker than the myths. The Vikings didn't just conquer Ireland. They became it, stitching their legacy into the land itself, one fjord named town and market word at a time. And as the last Norse kings of Dublin faded into legend, their echoes lingered, not in sagas, but in the mundane magic of place names and family trees, proof that history's deepest invasions leave no ruins. Just words passed down like heirlooms long after the swords rust away. Beneath Dublin's bustling streets, archaeologists unearthed a silent sentinel from the Viking Age, the Ship Street Great Burial, where a warrior lay entombed with his sword still clasped in skeletal hands. The blade, pattern welded and deadly even in rusted repose, spoke of a life lived by the axe. Beside him rested a shield boss, its iron dome dented from blows that once rained down in some forgotten skirmish. This wasn't just a grave, it was a statement. The Norse who buried their dead here weren't passing through, they were claiming the land, planting their dead like seeds of a new order. Nearby, other graves held scales and weights, tools of trade mingling with weapons of war, a testament to the duality of these settlers, merchants one day, warriors the next. Far from Dublin's shores, another discovery echoed Ireland's Viking story, the Cuerdale Hoard, a staggering trove of silver unearthed in England's River Ribble. Over 8,000 coins and ingots, some stamped with Arabic script, others hacked into rough, hack silver for trade, told a tale of far-flung connections. But what linked this treasure to Ireland? Many coins bore the marks of Dublin's mint, while others matched loot described in Irish annals, plunder from monasteries like Armagh and Clontarf. The hoard's sheer size hinted at a darker truth. Viking raids weren't just about survival, they were a calculated industry with Ireland as its bloody hub. Then came Wood Quay, the excavation that rewrote Dublin's history. Beneath layers of modern concrete, archaeologists found an entire Viking Age neighborhood preserved in the mud, homes with wattle walls, workshops where craftsmen shaped amber into beads, even a child's toy boat carved from oak. The real revelation, how ordinary it all seemed. These weren't the dragon ships of legend, but a community of families, their lives documented in fish bones and broken combs. A set of wooden gaming pieces, worn smooth from use, spoke of quiet evenings by the hearth, a world away from the raiding parties of saga lore. These discoveries did more than confirm the annals of Ulster's grim accounts, they humanized them. When the annals recorded the foreigners burned Clontarf in 842, we can now picture the torches reflected in stolen chalices, the smoke curling over the very silver that later filled hoards like Cuerdale. Archaeology reveals what chronicles omit. The Norse weren't just invaders but neighbors who celebrated, bartered, and buried their dead alongside the Irish. Yet their most enduring legacy might be how they reshaped Ireland's way of war. Before the Vikings, Irish battles were often ritualized cattle raids or clashes between rival kings. The Norse introduced something new, the concept of total war, where ports were sacked not for prestige but for profit. Irish kings, forced to adapt, began building fleets of their own, like the legendary naval victory of the Uí Néill in 917, where Gaelic ships ambushed a Viking fleet near Strangford Lough. The round towers that once sheltered monks became watchtowers, their bells repurposed as alarms. Even weapons evolved. The classic Irish scion dagger borrowed its curved design from Norse seaxes, a lethal souvenir of cultural collision. The graves, hoards, and hearths of Viking Ireland tell a story deeper than conquest. They reveal a transformation of how terror gave way to trade, how enemies became allies, and how an island once defined by its isolation learned to navigate a world suddenly much larger than its shores. The swords rusted, the silver scattered, but the changes they wrought would echo for centuries, etched not just in parchment, but in the very soil beneath our feet. Before the Vikings landed, Irish warfare was a dance of speed and cunning, lightly armed warriors striking from forests, then melting away like mist. The classic Irish fighter carried a short spear and a small leather shield, relying on ambush tactics honed over centuries of cattle raids and clan skirmishes. But when Norse longships disgorged warriors clad in chainmail, wielding broad axes and long, two-edged swords, the rules of battle changed overnight. The Vikings fought in tight shield walls, their overlapping barriers forming an impenetrable steel hedgehog. Against this disciplined formation, Ireland's hit-and-run tactics faltered. A charging Gaelic warrior might land one blow before being swallowed by the Norse defensive machine, his light spear useless against the sheer mass of interlocked shields. The Irish response was swift and pragmatic. By the mid-9th century, Gaelic kings began commissioning weapons from Norse smiths, heavy, pattern-welded swords that could cleave through enemy lines. Archaeologists have found these hybrid blades in Irish bogs, their hilts decorated with Celtic spirals, but their deadly efficiency pure Viking engineering. Even the iconic Irish ring forts evolved under Norse pressure. Places like Dun Ailin in Leinster, once ceremonial sites, were reforged into proper fortresses with deeper ditches and higher palisades. The circular design, perfect for repelling cattle raiders, now bristled with Norse-inspired defensive features, gatehouses modeled after Danish strongholds, parapets wide enough for archers to pick off attackers. Naval warfare saw the most dramatic shift. Pre-Viking Ireland had no true warships, just Currach's light-hide boats suited for river crossings. Faced with dragon-proud fleets, Irish kings scrambled to build their own versions of longships. The annals of Ulster record a pivotal moment in 917, when a Gaelic fleet ambushed Vikings near Strangford Lough using captured Norse vessels. This wasn't imitation, it was adaptation, turning the invaders' own tools against them. Yet the strangest twist came in how these former enemies became collaborators. Irish kings, quick to spot opportunity, began hiring Viking mercenaries as elite shock troops. The Norse brought more than muscle, they introduced new formations, like the Esvinfylking or boar's snout wedge, designed to punch through enemy lines. These hired blades didn't just fight for pay, they trained their employers. By the time of Brian Boru, Irish armies could deploy mixed forces, Gaelic skirmishers harrying flanks, while Norse-style heavy infantry held the center. This martial exchange bled into artistry. Norse smiths in Irish employ began crafting weapons adorned with Gaelic knotwork, while Irish metalworkers absorbed Viking animal motifs. The famous Cross of Cong, though Christian in purpose, bears intricate interlaced patterns that would feel at home on a Norse brooch. Even the legendary sword, Fragarach, said to have belonged to the sea god Manannán, was reimagined with a Viking-style fuller groove down its blade, a silent testament to how deeply these cultures had intertwined. What began as terror had become transformation. The Vikings didn't just teach Ireland how to fight, they reshaped its very idea of warfare, turning tribal skirmishes into something approaching national defense. And as swords were sheathed, these battlefield innovations would simmer into something even more enduring, a cultural fusion where the line between invader and native no longer mattered. The crozier of Clonmacnoise gleams with the fingerprints of two worlds colliding, its spiraling Celtic knots interrupted by the sinuous curves of a Norse dragon, its silver surface a battleground where Gaelic and Viking aesthetics forged an uneasy truce. This wasn't just art, it was archaeology in metal, proof that cultural exchange could be as violent as it was creative. The Mammon-style influences, named for a Danish burial site, appeared in Irish workshops as swirling tendrils and exaggerated animal limbs, their exaggerated curves a stark departure from the precise geometry of traditional interlace. Yet Irish artisans didn't merely copy these foreign motifs. They digested them, weaving Norse energy into Celtic complexity until pieces like the Cross of Cong emerged, its body a lattice of Gaelic spirals, its terminals writhing with urn-style serpents that seemed to slither between cultures as easily as they did across the gilded surface. What these objects reveal is a dialogue deeper than decoration. A Norse smith might hammer out a brooch for a Gaelic patron, only to find his client demanding the old interlaced patterns alongside the new beasts. Irish metalworkers, meanwhile, adopted Norse casting techniques, producing thinner, lighter pieces that retained their intricate detail. The Ardog chalice, for all its Christian purpose, bears the telltale punch marks of Viking tooling methods, evidence that sacred art could be shaped by heathen hands. Even everyday items like bone combs found in Dublin's Fishamble Street show this fusion, their teeth spaced with Norse precision but carved with Gaelic floral motifs. The decline of Viking political power after Clontarf didn't erase this artistic legacy. As Norse dynasties faded, their aesthetics endured in the hands of Irish craftsmen who'd made the style their own. The 12th century shrine of St. Patrick's Bell, though commissioned by Gaelic kings, boasts the same serpentine creatures that once adorned Viking sword hilts. By then, the distinction between native and foreign had blurred beyond recognition, just as a sword forged in Dublin might bear runes on its blade and a Gaelic blessing on its scabbard. The Vikings left Ireland not just with plundered treasure, but with a visual language that would outlast their rule, etched into the very objects meant to glorify the cultures they'd once terrorized. This synthesis outlived battles and kings because it answered a need neither culture could fulfill alone. The Norse brought dynamism, a sense of movement that breathed life into static Celtic designs. The Irish offered depth, their intricate patterns giving Viking boldness a contemplative richness. Together, they created something neither could have imagined, a style that turned conflict into collaboration and invasion into inspiration. The true measure of their impact isn't in the kingdoms they toppled, but in the art they left behind, a testament to how even the fiercest enemies can become unwitting partners in creativity. By the time the Normans set their sights on Ireland in the 12th century, the island was already a shadow of its former self, not because of defeat, but because the Vikings had spent centuries rewriting its rules of power. The once proud Gaelic kingdoms, fractured by generations of Norse manipulation and infighting, now resembled a chessboard with half its pieces missing. When Strongbow and his Anglo-Norman knights landed near Wexford in 1169, they weren't charging into a united nation. They were stepping onto a battlefield the Vikings had prepared for them. Wexford itself was the perfect example of this twisted legacy. Founded by Norse settlers as Vasafjörður, its deep harbor and sturdy walls made it an ideal Norman beachhead. The town's Hiberno-Norse inhabitants, descendants of Viking traders and Irish mothers, barely resisted the invaders. Why would they? These were pragmatic merchants, not warriors. Their ancestors had learned long ago that survival meant bending to stronger forces. First Irish kings, now Normans. Dublin followed suit, its Norse Gaelic elite opening the gates after a token siege. The very ports that had made Viking Ireland rich now became the arteries of Norman conquest, their docks unloading not furs and silver, but armored warhorses and siege engines. The irony was bitter. The Vikings, who'd once shattered Ireland's unity, had inadvertently set the stage for its next domination. Their decentralized trading towns lacked the deep-rooted loyalty of Gaelic dynasties, making them easy targets for Norman takeover. Even Irish kings who'd hired Norse mercenaries for generations found their old tactics useless against Norman heavy cavalry. The shock of facing knights in full chainmail, descendants of the same Norse invaders who'd terrorized Europe, must have felt like history's cruelest joke. Yet the Normans didn't erase Viking urbanism, they built on it. Dublin's street grid, originally laid out by Norse settlers, remained intact under Norman rule. The city's Hiberno-Norse merchants simply swapped their old Norse patrons for new Norman ones, their trade networks now feeding continental Europe instead of Scandinavia. Waterford's shipwrights, trained in Viking-era techniques, now constructed vessels for Norman lords. The urban DNA the Norse implanted the idea of towns as commercial hubs rather than royal strongholds proved more enduring than any kingdom. What began as Viking chaos ended as Norman order, but the true victor was the city itself. Long after the last Norse king of Dublin faded into myth, his greatest invention lived on, a vision of Ireland not as a patchwork of tribes, but as a land where walls and harbors could outlast crowns. The Normans may have conquered the island, but they did it on foundations the Vikings had laid stone by stone, port by port, in a silent revolution no saga could have predicted. Before the Vikings carved their harbors into Ireland's coastline, the island had no true towns, just scattered ring forts, monastic enclaves, and seasonal gathering places. Power was measured in cattle and land, not cobbled streets or market squares. Then came the Norse with their instinct for trade and their knack for picking strategic locations. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, these weren't just raids turned settlements. They were experiments in urban living, Ireland's first real taste of what it meant to build a life around commerce rather than clan loyalty. Walk the curve of Fishamble Street in Dublin today, and you're tracing the same path Viking merchants did 1,000 years ago, where the original wooden quays once bristled with ships from as far away as Iceland and Spain. The street's gentle arc following the Liffey's Bend wasn't planned by some medieval bureaucrat. It was shaped by the daily tread of Norse boots hauling barrels of wine and bales of wool. Waterford tells a similar story, its narrow, winding lanes bearing names like Ballybricken from the Norse Bali meaning town still follow the irregular grid laid out by Viking settlers. Unlike the geometric precision of Roman cities, these streets grew organically, snaking around natural features and clustering near docks. Excavations beneath modern buildings reveal layers of Norse-era planking, wharves built from split oak trunks that never stopped bearing weight, just adapted to new generations. These weren't temporary camps. They were designed to last, with property boundaries so enduring that Anglo-Norman invaders simply took them over rather than redraw the maps. The real revolution, though, was in how these towns functioned. Viking Dublin had specialized districts, a fish market here, a metalworkers' quarter there, something unheard of in rural Gaelic society. A man's worth was no longer counted in cows but in silver pennies weighed on brass scales. The Norse introduced the idea of property ownership detached from tribal land, where a craftsman could pass his shop to his son without begging a king's permission. When the Anglo-Normans arrived, they didn't dismantle this system. They bureaucratized it, turning Viking trading posts into administrative hubs. Dublin's Christchurch Cathedral, founded by Norse King Sitric Silkbeard, became the seat of Norman archbishops, its crypts stuffed with charters written in Latin but stamped with the same pragmatism that once governed Viking deals. Urbanization reshaped Irish society at its core. Where clans had measured time by cattle raids and harvests, now the rhythm came from market days and toll collectors. The old Brehon laws, built for rural disputes over straying livestock, strained to address cases of stolen ship cargo or counterfeit coins. Even the landscape-changed forests were cleared to build fleets, pastures gave way to tanneries and dye works. The Irish didn't just adopt towns, they absorbed the mentality that came with them. By the 12th century, Gaelic kings like Brian Boru's descendants were building their own urban strongholds, copying Norse layouts but topping them with round towers in a symbolic blend of old and new. And the people, modern genetic studies reveal how deeply the Vikings wove themselves into Ireland's DNA. Up to 20% of men in coastal areas carry the Norse-originated R1, a haplogroup, a silent echo of those long-ago settlers. Surnames like Doyle, Oacute Dubgale, a dark foreigner, or McManus from Magnus aren't just linguistic artifacts, they're family heirlooms written in chromosomes. The real surprise isn't how much Viking blood flows in Irish veins, but how quickly those lines blurred within a few generations. A Dublin Norseman might bear a Gaelic name, attend Mass, and still trade walrus ivory with his cousins in Norway. The cities they built became melting pots where bloodlines mixed as freely as silver and silk, reshaping what it meant to be Irish in ways far beyond what any raider could have imagined. The science of surnames and DNA tells a story no chronicle could, how Viking blood still pulses through Irish veins 1,000 years later. Genetic studies reveal a striking pattern. Up to 1 in 5 men along Ireland's eastern coast carry the R1A haplogroup, a distinct marker tracing back to Norse ancestors. In places like Dublin and Wexford, where Viking longforts once thrived, this genetic fingerprint is most concentrated, as if the land itself remembers where those first settlers anchored their ships. But it's not just chromosomes that betray this legacy. Surnames like Doyle from the Gaelic Oacute Dubgail, meaning descendant of the dark foreigner, or MacAuliffe, Mac-Ambib, son of Olaf, are linguistic time capsules, preserving the names of Norse fathers who took Irish wives and stayed. Then there's the so-called warrior gene, a variant of the Maor gene linked to risk-taking behavior found in higher frequencies among Irish and Scandinavian populations. While it's a stretch to blame genetics for Viking raids, the coincidence is tantalizing, a whisper of shared temperament between the descendants of berserkers and the Gaels who fought them. Yet genetics alone can't capture the full picture. Modern Ireland's relationship with its Viking past isn't just about blood. It's about how those centuries of collision and collaboration reshaped identity itself. For every Irish family with a Norse surname, there are countless others who absorbed Viking culture without a single genetic trace, through trade, language, or sheer proximity. Folklore offers its own twisted testimony. Irish myths are haunted by Viking shadows, from the shape-shifting Fomorians, grotesque sea raiders eerily reminiscent of Norse invaders, to tales of the Gael Gael, the foreign Gaels who straddled both worlds. In one Kerry legend, a local chieftain's daughter falls for a Viking warrior, only for their love to spark a war that splits the land between mountain and sea. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're cultural processing, a way to grapple with the trauma and transformation the Vikings wrought. What emerges is a paradox. The Norse came as destroyers, yet they became threads in Ireland's social fabric, their DNA and legends woven into the national psyche. Today, a Doyle might never think of himself as anything but Irish, even as his surname whispers of a long-ago ancestor who rode from Scandinavia under a raven banner. The Vikings didn't just leave behind ruins or relics, they left living proof that history isn't written in ink or stone, but in the very bodies and names of the people who inherit it. The Irish didn't just remember the Vikings, they reimagined them, weaving their invaders into legends where history blurred with myth. Take the infamous Turgesius, the Viking warlord who appears in Irish chronicles as both a demon and a doomed romantic. Some tales paint him as a brute who defiled monasteries and declared himself a pagan god, while others claim he married the daughter of an Irish king, only to be drowned in a cunning trap at Lough Owel. The truth, he was likely an amalgam of multiple Norse leaders, his myth inflated by generations of storytellers grappling with the trauma of invasion. What's fascinating isn't the exaggeration, it's the ambivalence. Even as folklore vilified Vikings, it couldn't ignore their humanity. The saga of the Earls of Orkney, preserved in Irish manuscripts like the Book of Leinster, doesn't just recount battles, it delves into alliances, marriages, and moments of unexpected loyalty between Norse and Gael. This duality echoes in the Irish annals. Cryptic labels Fine Gael and Dub Gael, fair foreigners and dark foreigners. Scholars still debate whether these terms distinguished Danes from Norwegians, early settlers from latecomers, or even Christians from pagans. But the underlying message is clear. The Irish recognized Vikings weren't a monolith. Some were destroyers, yes, but others became neighbors, allies, even kin. The fragmentary annals of Ireland recount a Norse king named Tomrere, who fought alongside the High King Niall Glundub in the early 10th century, not as a mercenary, but as a sworn brother-in-arms. Folklore took this complexity and spun it into metaphor. The Fomorians, those monstrous sea raiders of Irish myth, gained new Viking-like traits in post-invasion tales, their once abstract menace now clad in furs and wielding axes. Yet counterpoint legends emerged, like the story of the Gael children of mixed Norse-Irish heritage, who navigated both worlds with fluid grace. In one Kerry folktale, a Viking smith teaches a local craftsman the secret of pattern welding swords, a gift wrapped in rivalry and grudging respect. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were a way to process the uncomfortable truth that enemies could also be teachers, that bloodlines could blur, and that the line between us and them was never as solid as it seemed. Modern Ireland still grapples with this layered legacy. Dublin's annual Viking Festival lets kids don horned helmets, historically inaccurate but irresistibly fun, while reenactors demonstrate Norse blacksmithing techniques that revolutionized Irish metalwork. Museums display the Kells Crozier, its interlaced beasts a fusion of Celtic and Viking artistry, without flinching from the raids that made such synthesis possible. Even DNA tourism thrives, with companies offering genetic tests to trace Norse ancestry, not as a mark of otherness, but as proof of Ireland's tangled, resilient identity. The Vikings didn't just leave behind ruins or relics, they left a question etched into the national psyche. What does it mean to conquer, and what does it mean to belong? The answer, it seems, changes with every retelling. Today, Ireland's Viking past isn't just studied, it's celebrated, commercialized, and sometimes even contested. Take Dublin's Viking Splash Tour, where visitors don plastic helmets and roar like Norse warriors as an amphibious vehicle splashes into the Liffey. It's kitschy, sure, but beneath the laughter lies something deeper, a way to make history tactile, turning invaders into mascots without erasing their impact. Nearby, the National Museum displays the real artifacts, rusty swords and silver hoards, while outside, souvenir shops sell plush toy longships. This duality is everywhere. In Waterford, the annual Viking Triangle Festival lets kids forge pretend runes alongside blacksmiths using techniques passed down from Norse craftsmen. The message is clear: these weren't just raiders, they were neighbors, innovators, part of Ireland's story. Television has amplified this fascination. When Vikings filmed in County Wicklow's rugged landscapes, it wasn't just scenery the producers borrowed, it was heritage. The show's depiction of Ragnar Lothbrok raiding England was shot where actual Norse fleets once anchored, blurring fiction and history. Tourism boards capitalized, offering Viking trail maps that guide visitors to filming locations and archaeological sites alike. But not everyone cheers the hype. Scholars wince when shows simplify the complex alliances between Norse settlers and Gaelic kings, or when festivals gloss over the slave markets that once thrived where families now pose for photos. The debate isn't about ignoring the past, it's about how to remember it. Yet even the controversies reveal something profound. Ireland's Norse legacy is no longer a source of shame but of pride, a testament to resilience. The Vikings didn't just take, they left behind words, art, even urban blueprints that shaped modern Ireland. Dublin's city seal features a ship, not a castle, a nod to its maritime founders. Schools teach children Norse-derived phrases like slaint, from slain, meaning health, toasting with a word that's traveled from mead halls to modern pubs. This isn't revisionism, it's recognition that history is rarely black and white. The ripple effects of those first raids extend far beyond souvenirs or TV backdrops. They forced Ireland to engage with the wider world, transforming an insular society into a player on Europe's stage. The same ports built for pillaging became hubs for trade. The same mixed-blood descendants of Vikings and Gaels who once navigated two cultures now emblematic of Ireland's global identity. What began with fire and terror evolved into something far more enduring, a reminder that even the darkest chapters can give way to renewal, and that invaders in time might become family. For generations, Irish history books painted the Vikings as one-dimensional villains, savage destroyers who left nothing but ashes and sorrow. This nationalist narrative, shaped by centuries of resistance to English rule, framed the Norse as the ultimate other, a foil to Ireland's romanticized Gaelic past. Monasteries burned, treasures looted, innocents enslaved. These were the stories that stuck, reinforcing a vision of Vikings as mindless agents of chaos. But over the past 50 years, scholars like Don Chad Oakute Corain have turned this black and white tale upside down. His groundbreaking work revealed a far messier truth. The Vikings weren't just wreckers, they were catalysts, forcing Ireland to adapt in ways that ultimately strengthened its place in medieval Europe. Archaeology has been the hammer shattering old assumptions. Excavations at Wood Quay didn't just uncover Viking weapons, they revealed fish bones, chess pieces, and loom weights, proof that Norse settlers were as likely to mend nets as swing axes. The discovery of Hiberno-Norse coins minted in Dublin challenged the myth of Vikings as mere pirates, showing they built complex economies. Even the infamous slave trade, once portrayed as purely Viking-driven, is now understood as a system Irish elites willingly exploited. Finds like the Ballandurry gaming board, a hybrid of Norse and Gaelic designs, speak louder than any chronicle. These cultures didn't just collide, they conversed, blending traditions in unexpected ways. The debate over urbanization cuts to the heart of this reassessment. Would Ireland's scattered monastic settlements have naturally evolved into towns without Viking stimulus? Some argue yes, pointing to pre-Norse trading sites like the Oseberg ships' Irish-made buckets, but others counter that without Norse ship technology and trade networks, Ireland might have remained a rural backwater. Dublin's street grid, its division into craft quarters, even its early tax systems, all bear the unmistakable stamp of Viking urban planning. The truth likely lies in between. The Norse didn't invent Irish cities, but they accelerated their development by centuries, grafting continental urban models onto Gaelic society. Comparing Ireland's experience to other Viking-influenced regions reveals striking contrasts. In England, Norse settlers were largely absorbed within generations, leaving place names but few lasting institutions. In Normandy, they became French-speaking dukes, but in Ireland, the Vikings created a third path, neither conquerors nor conquered, but power brokers who reshaped the rules of the game. While York's Jorvik faded after the Norman conquest, Dublin thrived, its Hiberno-Norse elite adapting to every wave of invaders. This adaptability hints at something deeper. Ireland didn't just survive the Viking Age, it metabolized it, turning invasion into innovation and trauma into transformation. The echoes of that process still resonate wherever a Dublin pub-goer raises a glass with a Norse-derived slaint, or a tourist walks streets laid out by long-forgotten Norse feet. This scholarly shift mirrors wider changes in how we view cultural collisions, not as zero-sum conflicts, but as messy, creative encounters where loss and gain intertwine. The Vikings didn't give Ireland towns or trade. They forced it to reimagine itself, setting in motion changes that would ripple far beyond their era. What began as fire and fear ended as something far more enduring, a lesson in how societies can absorb the worst shocks and emerge not just intact but reinvented. When Viking longships first scraped onto England's shores, they met a landscape already stitched together by Roman roads and Saxon kings. Wessex, under Alfred the Great, could rally armies and build fortified towns designed to choke off Norse advances. Francia had Charlemagne's legacy, a spine of castles and cavalry that forced Vikings to bargain rather than conquer outright. But Ireland, it was a fractured quilt of petty kingdoms where a high king's authority barely stretched beyond his own cattle herds. This wasn't just political weakness, it was geographic destiny. England's narrow rivers and open downs allowed Saxon shield walls to march swiftly against invaders, while Ireland's dense forests and boggy midlands made coordinated defense nearly impossible. A Norse warband raiding up the Shannon could vanish into the wilderness long before distant clans even heard the alarm. The Danelaw, that Viking-controlled swath of England, always existed in tension with Saxon rule. Norse settlers there adopted Christianity, minted coins with Anglo-Saxon kings' faces, and eventually melted into the local population. In Normandy, Rollo's Vikings became French-speaking dukes within a generation, trading Thor's hammer for the fleur-de-lis. But Ireland's Norse carved out a third path neither assimilated nor overthrown. Why? Because Ireland lacked a Wessex. Without a central power to expel or absorb them, the Vikings became just another player in an already crowded Game of Thrones. Dublin's kings intermarried with Gaelic dynasties, patronized monasteries they'd once pillaged, and ruled hybrid Hiberno-Norse towns that answered to no high king. Unlike Normandy or Danelaw, these weren't conquered territories. They were independent city-states, thriving in the cracks between Ireland's fractured kingdoms. Geography sealed the deal. England's compact size meant Alfred's successors could eventually squeeze the Danelaw into submission. But Ireland's jagged coasts, those same inlets that made raiding easy, also made lasting conquest impossible. A Norse longfort like Waterford, nestled between mountains and sea, could withstand Irish attacks indefinitely, resupplied by ships slipping past blockades. Meanwhile, Ireland's lack of urban centers before the Vikings meant there was no existing template to resist their town building. When Saxons rebuilt London or York, they restored something familiar. The Irish had no before to return to, just a new reality where Dublin's docks and markets became irreplaceable, yet the starkest difference lay underfoot. While Viking settlers in England ploughed open fields already tamed by Romans and Saxons, Ireland's Norse encountered a frontier. Pollen studies show they cleared vast oak forests for pasture, introducing rye and oats that thrived in coastal soils. Their ships brought not just weapons, but new species, the Norwegian rat-hardy sheep breeds, even apple varieties that still bear Norse names. In England, Vikings adapted to the land. In Ireland, they reshaped it. The legacy lingers today. Place names like Strangford, Strong Fjord, or Lakeslip, Salmon Leap aren't just linguistic fossils, they're environmental ones, marking how Norse eyes read a landscape and rewrote it in their own tongue. The Vikings didn't just conquer Ireland, they reprogrammed its ecology, turning wild coasts into cosmopolitan hubs where the ghosts of raiders still walk the streets as merchants, kings, and eventually neighbors. The Vikings didn't just reshape Ireland's politics and culture, they rewrote its very ecology, leaving fingerprints on the land that endure to this day. When Norse ships landed, they brought more than axes and silver. Their hulls carried stowaways that would forever alter Ireland's natural balance. Take the humble rabbit, often credited to the Normans, but skeletal remains in Dublin's Viking layers suggest an earlier introduction. These weren't just pets or pests, they were a food source, their rapid reproduction providing a steady protein supply for Norse settlements. More controversial is the Irish hare, its genetic distinctiveness sparking debates. Some scholars argue its ancestors hitched a ride from Norway, Adapting so seamlessly they became symbols of the island itself. Forests bore the brunt of Viking ambition. Ireland's dense oak woodlands, sacred to the Druids and vital for Gaelic cattle grazing, fell to Norse axes in staggering numbers. Shipbuilding demanded straight, tall trunks. Each longship required up to 30 mature oaks, while clearing land for rye cultivation left hillsides bare. Pollen studies from bogs tell a stark story. A sharp decline in tree species like hazel and alder during the 9th century, replaced by the telltale signature of cereal crops. The Norse didn't just chop trees, they engineered an agricultural revolution. Rye, a cold, hardy grain rare in pre-Viking Ireland, became a staple, its deep roots thriving in soils too poor for native wheat. Fields that once fed cattle now baked dense, dark bread, a dietary shift etched into the teeth of skeletal remains, where dental wear shows a gritty, grain-heavy diet post-invasion. Even the coastline transformed. Norse place names like Strangford, Strong Fjord, or Wexford, Mudflat Fjord, reveal how they read the land through a navigator's eyes, naming not for beauty, but utility. Their settlements clustered where rivers met tides, creating harbors that funneled fish migrations into waiting nets. Archaeologists find Norse-style fish weirs in estuaries, their woven hazel traps funneling salmon toward waiting spears. This wasn't just subsistence, it was surplus. Dried fish from Irish waters fed Norse traders as far away as Iceland, turning local ecosystems into nodes in a sprawling North Atlantic economy. The most enduring changes were invisible to the eye. Norse rats, stowaways in grain shipments, outcompeted native rodents, their bones dominating urban trash heaps. Introduced earthworms, churning through previously undisturbed soils, altered nutrient cycles in ways that favored Norse crops over native grasses. Even the apple orchards of modern Ireland may owe their origins to Viking grafts, hardy varieties like the Ardcairn russet, showing genetic links to Norse cultivars. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate acts of ecological engineering, turning Ireland into a familiar landscape for settlers pining for Scandinavian homesteads. Yet this transformation came at a cost. Deforestation triggered erosion, silting up rivers and choking salmon spawning grounds. The Irish hare, if indeed a Norse import, displaced native species in a silent takeover. And those rye fields, they demanded constant expansion, pushing Gaelic pastoralists onto marginal lands and fueling conflicts over territory. The Vikings didn't just raid Ireland's wealth, they reshaped its very soil, setting in motion changes that would outlast their kingdoms. As the last Norse longships faded from memory, their true legacy wasn't just in ruined monasteries or hybrid art. It was in the rustle of rye stalks on hillsides they'd cleared, the burrows of rabbits they'd loosed, and the gnarled apple trees still fruiting 1,000 winters later. The land itself became a parchment, inscribed with runes of roots and furrows, telling a story not of conquest, but of coexistence, one where even the invaders, in time, became part of the ecology they'd irrevocably altered. The sack of Armagh wasn't just another raid, it was the spark that lit a fuse, igniting changes so profound they reshaped Ireland's destiny. In that single act of violence, the Vikings exposed the fragility of Ireland's old order, setting off a chain reaction that would ripple through centuries. The monasteries, once the uncontested centers of power and learning, began fortifying their walls with round towers, their monks trading quills for swords. Kings who had spent generations feuding over cattle now faced an existential threat, one that forced them to rethink alliances, warfare, and even what it meant to rule. But the true revolution wasn't just in how Ireland defended itself, it was in how the island began to reimagine itself. The the Vikings, often painted as mere destroyers, became unlikely architects of Ireland's future. Their long forts, those fortified trading posts along rivers like the Liffey and the Shannon, evolved into something unprecedented: towns. For the first time, Ireland had urban centers where commerce, not clan loyalty, dictated daily life. Dublin's winding streets, still echoing their Viking Age layout, became a melting pot of Gaelic and Norse cultures. Here, Irish wool met Frankish wine, and Norse silver mingled with Arabic coins, weaving Ireland into a web of European trade that stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the sun-baked markets of Constantinople. The Vikings didn't just take, they connected, turning an isolated island into a crossroads of continents. And then there's the art, those stunning fusions of Norse ferocity and Celtic intricacy. The Cross of Cong, with its serpentine beasts coiled around Christian symbols, isn't just beautiful, it's a testament to cultural alchemy. Viking metalworkers taught Irish craftsmen new techniques, while Gaelic scribes infused Norse designs with spiritual depth. Even language tells this story. Words like margad for market or bod for boat slipped into everyday speech, subtle reminders that the invaders had become neighbors. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the bloodlines. Genetic studies reveal that up to 20% of Irish men along the eastern coast carry Norse ancestry, proof that the Vikings didn't just raid and leave. They stayed, married, and became part of Ireland's DNA. Surnames like Doyle and MacAuliffe whisper of this blended heritage, their origins hidden in plain sight. So here's the provocative twist. Without that raid on Armagh, would Ireland have developed so distinctly? Would it have become the urbanized, interconnected society that later drew the Normans, the English, and eventually the world? The Vikings didn't just change Ireland, they forced it to evolve, pushing it onto a stage it might never have stepped onto otherwise. Next time you walk Dublin's streets or admire the intricate metalwork in its museums, remember, you're seeing the legacy of a single, seismic moment in history. What other hidden stories lie beneath the surface? Share your thoughts below, and maybe even plan a visit to Dublin's Viking museums to see the evidence for yourself. The past isn't just preserved in artifacts, it's alive in the very fabric of the island.